Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. And today I am bringing you another installment of Rotten Recommendations. And this time it is special because this is my Pride Month Rotten Recommendations video. If anyone doesn't know, I, at the beginning of this month, came out as aromantic asexual, and I'm also dressed for the occasion today. I got this new choker recently. I've been wanting a little spiky choker anyway, but this one has the colors of the ace pride flag on it, which delights me. It also happens to go with my Black Sabbath t-shirt, which is nice. I want to show support through this video for the LGBTQ community in horror by spotlighting a few movies that have some decent representation in them, some shows that I think do the same, and by spotlighting some fellow queer horror YouTubers. But before I want to get into that, I just want to say I have looked everywhere for asexual and aromantic representation in horror, and there is next to nothing out there. There is one vampire character in some TV show that I've forgotten the name of. Archie Comics has some horror comics, Jughead's in them. He's an ace character, and there's one throwaway gag in Hubie Halloween, which isn't even really horror, that references a character being ace. So there's pretty much next to nothing out there, and you have to dig really hard to find it, and as far as I know, there's actually nothing out there for aromanticism. So if anyone out there knows of asexual or aromantic characters in horror, please tell me. I need to know. So first off, we have Bit. This is kind of the obvious choice right now. A lot of people have been talking about this one this month. It came out last year. It is my favorite horror movie of last year, and it follows a transgender girl named Laurel who travels to the big city and falls in with a group of feminist vampires, and they feel more or less like a all-female version of the Lost Boys, who are much more feminist and a lot more aggressively violent, to be honest. The movie is nuanced in terms of the way it handles feminism. It's not black and white, even though some of the characters in the story look at it that way. They don't make a huge deal out of Laurel being transgender, but they do acknowledge it, and it is a part of her character. So it's there, but it's also being normalized, which is wonderful. It's also just really fun. There are some over-the-top kills, there's some hysterical banter, there's a weird flashback sequence with this Dracula-style master vampire that's set to Rasputin by Boney M, and it's freaking weird, and I love it. It's not a perfect movie, but it was completely satisfying on every front to me, and it's just a lot of fun. Next up, we have Blood of the Tribbies, which is a movie that I talked about for my Women in Horror Month Rotten Recommendations video, and is a movie that I just really can't shut up about lately. I recommend it at every chance I get, but that's just because I really love this movie and next to nobody talks about it. It is kind of an homage to both Hammer's 70s, slightly sleazier vampire movies, things in the vein of the Karnstein trilogy, and other 70s vampire exploitation movies, things like Jean Rollins stuff, which I have not gotten into yet, but it has a decidedly more modern approach to everything, and you have both two of the protagonists being a lesbian couple, which of course is a thing in all of these 70s lesbian vampire movies, but the way Blood of the Tribbies handles it is a lot more sympathetic to their plight and definitely a bit more self-aware of what it's doing. And then you have the over-the-top villains of the story who are hyper-masculine, very misogynistic, but there is this weird, campy way in which that almost becomes homoerotic, and by almost I mean 100% does. There are just these ridiculous, uncomfortable, over-the-top scenes that I almost don't want to watch, but they're clearly just having too much fun making this movie, so I can't look away. It's the kind of movie that goes into some nasty territory that usually I would not be okay with watching, but because there's this self-awareness to the movie, and because of the edge of camp and low budgetness of everything, it just becomes really fun while still being dark and actually having a very strong message to it. Next up, we have Anna and the Apocalypse, which is a movie you know I will not shut up about because I spent all of last December covering a ton of music from it and doing a live watch along for it. I own the soundtrack on vinyl. I own the novelization. I have a problem. The movie itself is not particularly queer-centric in any way. It's a solid story about a group of kids in high school who have to deal with the zombie apocalypse on Christmas, and it's also a musical. It is included on this list because of the character of Steph, played by Sarah Swire, who is one of my favorite characters in the movie. She is a lesbian, but that is not the focus of her character. Again, that's a part of her character, and it is definitely acknowledged, but by not making a huge deal out of it, they are normalizing it, and she's just one of the most fun and hilarious characters in the movie, and she also has this awkwardness about her that's both really funny and also really hard to watch because it can be very relatable at times. Next up, we have The Unwanted, which is an adaptation of Carmilla, and I could not do this video without talking about Carmilla at least once. I have talked about a lot of other Carmilla adaptations at length already. I did a whole series of reviews on the Karnstein trilogy. I have recommended The Blood-Spattered Bride before. I've recommended The Moth Diaries, which is loosely inspired by Carmilla in some ways, but I wanted to talk about The Unwanted today because it is one of the more unique takes on the story I've seen, because it transposes the whole thing to the American South, and there is an element of bloodiness and sort of kind of vampirism to it, but the real horror of it is that you have this Carmilla character and this Laura type character. I don't recall if her name is Laura or not. I think it is. And the kind of homophobia that they're subjected to, but also the Laura character has some kind of self-loathing issues, some self-harm issues, which kind of play into the vampiric aspect of everything in an uncomfortable way. It's not a fun movie. It's really depressing. I don't like the ending, but it's beautifully shot, it's really well acted, and it is one of the most unique takes on the Carmilla story that I have seen, so if any of that sounds good to you, please do check this one out. Next up, we have Wild Zero, which is a movie that wasn't even going to make it onto this list because I didn't even watch it until a few days ago when Queenie Todd showed it on their stream with Dave Maggot and the Movie Void. I had heard about this movie before. It's a really low budget, really over-the-top, cheesy movie following the Japanese punk band Guitar Wolf as they face down zombies and encounter aliens, and this movie made it onto the list because it does have an instance of surprisingly decent trans representation, especially for 1990-something when this came out. It's not subtle in the way the kind of subtle normalized representation I've talked about on this list already is. It's very, very heavy-handed and very explicit, but the character of Ace's arc in the movie forces him to overcome his transphobia to be with a girl that he has fallen in love with, and there's even just these random hilarious but also genuinely wonderful moments where members of Guitar Wolf will just appear to him when he's kind of having these little bouts of transphobia and just yell things like, "Rock and roll has no boundaries. Love is not constrained by boundaries of gender or place," or so on and so forth. And they're really over the top and really funny, but the sentiment there is very genuine, and despite the over the top, ridiculous, almost trauma feel that the movie has, the core of everything is really heartfelt, and by the end of everything, there's this really adorable romance happening with a trans character, and I don't know how the actual filmmakers stand on those issues. It might have just been thrown in there just for shock value, and they didn't bat an eyelid because of the other just really, really crazy things that are happening in the movie, and they were just like, this is another crazy thing that we can throw in there, but it's a genuinely likable character and a cute little relationship, and I really enjoyed the movie despite it being utterly ridiculous, and I think a lot of people will as well, so it's on the list. And speaking of Dave Maggot, I do want to plug his movie Groundhog here as well, because while it is first and foremost a hilarious horror comedy slasher that kind of plays into the holiday-themed slasher genre, in this case being based around Groundhog Day, it is also the only slasher movie I've ever seen that has a final girl couple in it. That's kind of a spoiler, but also I have to talk about it because it's the reason the movie's on the list. It is handled in a really straightforward and sweet way that, again, makes the movie very heartfelt despite the totally ridiculous, over-the-top, both dark and hilarious, gory tone of everything. First up, we have The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. This is a show that I really loved when I was watching the first 2 seasons of it. I kind of got iffy on it. In the 3rd season, the way that handles paganism is really weird, and I didn't like the ending at all, even though I did enjoy the 4th season. But one thing that the show does have throughout is pretty solid queer representation, and I'm going to be focusing on the character of Theo here because he is one of the only trans guys that I've seen in much of anything. There are only a few other kind of unique attributes to the character of Theo outside of his being trans. That's kind of his big character arc, but he's a really likable character, and the whole show is just really, really fun. Next up is the Scream TV series, mostly seasons 1 and 2. There's also a gay character in season 3. I don't think he's handled as well as the character I'm going to talk about for the first season, and I have a lot of problems with season 3 anyway, but that's a rant for another day. Seasons 1 and 2 are very much in the same vein as the movies, but have their own completely unique killer backstory, and it makes use of a lot of modern technology like texting and live video chats to kind of put new spins on the phone-centric horror that we get in the Scream movies, and there's a lot of the great meta horror stuff going on as well. It's included here because of the character of Aubrey, who starts out being bi-curious, if you will. Her nickname actually is bi-curious at the beginning of the show, but as the story progresses, she's just outright bisexual, and she's just a really fun character. Her and her friend, whose name I am forgetting right now, I'll put it down here, have a lot of really great banter. They're kind of both the Randy of the TV series in the way they riff off of a lot of different horror movies and compare the situations in those movies to what's going on there. I do also want to recommend the Carmilla web series. Even though it isn't exactly horror, it has a similar tone, in my opinion, to something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I feel like Silas University is definitely also built on a Hellmouth. You've obviously got the adorable relationship between Carmilla and Laura, but also the character of La Fontaine, who is one of the only non-binary characters I've seen in anything. But again, it's kind of a part of their character arc, but also not the focal point of their character. They're kind of the technology geek bordering on mad scientist, and they kind of have a possible romance going on with a ghost that lives in the school's library catalog, which is fun. I don't think the Carmilla series is going to be for everyone. Again, it's not straight up horror, but it definitely leans into the supernatural and the macabre in a lot of ways, and I think it's a lot of fun. I would like to recommend a few YouTubers really quick. I don't want to delve too deep into them because I'm kind of on a tight schedule right now, but I am going to list them really quick. Jen's Reviews from the Grave. Jen is a straight woman, but Christian, who is co-host of the show, is neither of those things, and they're on here because they, a couple weeks ago, did a LGBTQ horror week and covered a lot of great movies, some of which I've seen and love, some of which I really need to see, and some of which I now have no desire to see. Video Nasty, who I have talked about before, they are non-binary, and they also have a great series of videos called Queering the Slasher, which I highly recommend looking into. It delves into the history of horror as it relates to the history of the LGBTQ community and talks about queer coding in horror movies and just outright representation in movies in essay form in a really great way. So what Jen and Christian's video series has been discussing, and a good portion of what Video Nasty's stuff is centered around queer horror, but I did also want to just list a few other queer creators of horror content on YouTube just off the top of my head really quick. I'm not going to go as in depth with this just because I want to keep this relatively brief, even though it probably isn't very brief, but Ciara Celine, Queenie Todd, Dice Rollin, Andrew Ballina, The Movie Void, Nightmare Maven, Red Rusty 66. There are a lot of great content creators out there. Please, in the comments below, let me know what some of your favorite horror movies, shows, books, whatever, that feature queer characters or are queer-coded somehow are, and recommend any other content creators you like. And please, if you know of any Ace or Arrow characters in horror, I mean any media really is great, but especially horror, please let me know because I am desperately searching for something. Those are my LGBTQ horror recommendations. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!